Good morning, everybody. Hope you're having a good day today, wherever you're located around the world. Today will be our final class in our course. Let me just froze up there for a minute, sorry. So today will be our final class in our auditing course. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for attending the course. It would be nice, of course, if we were face-to-face, but we weren't able to do that this term. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending class and doing so well on the exams and the assignments so far. The final assignment that you've submitted has not been fully graded yet, but I will try and do that over the coming week. So you can watch for your marks on the final assignment next week. I want to spend our class time today talking about the final exam. The date of the final exam is April 22nd, which is a Thursday, and it's scheduled to start at 7 p.m. The final exam is going to be 1.5 hours in length. Okay, the registrar has allowed a 3-hour time frame. They do that for all exams, but it's up to the instructors to determine how long their final exam will be. So in this case, it will be in 1.5 hours. It'll start at 7 p.m. But what I will do is I'll be similar to the midterm exam. I'll be uploading the final exam to Blackboard about 10 minutes before 7 or so. And then you'll be able to download it. So let's say by 6:50 or 6:55 p.m., somewhere in there, you'll be able to download it and get ready to write the final exam. I will be sending you both a Word document and an Excel worksheet. All your answers should be recorded on the Excel worksheet. And at the end of the examination period, you'll just return your Excel worksheet to myself, okay, by email to djones@uwindsor.ca. I will be sending out an email, okay, message with written instructions on all this process, so you don't have to worry about that. And I'll be doing that several days before the exam. But again, the exam will start at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so promptly at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And everybody must write at that time frame. So I know around the world we have different time zones. So I apologize if you're getting up during the night to write the final exam. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out a way around that one yet, but we appreciate you devoting your time to writing the final exam at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, wherever you're located. So let's talk about the areas that we've covered in the course, okay? And so these would be the main topical areas that you should make sure that you spend some time on in your studying. If you do have questions, of course, feel free to email me while you're doing your preparation, okay, for the final exam. That's fine, no problem. And hopefully when we get back on campus, I certainly encourage you to introduce yourselves to me, and we can get to know each other on a personal level to some degree, okay? So with respect to the final exam, the format, excuse me, will be multiple choice questions or true and false questions, okay? And of course, there'll be several topic areas mentioned, and we're going to mention those topical areas now. So again, if you cover these areas, you'll be fine for the final exam. Of course, if you have any questions as you're studying, please do touch base with me before the exam. Okay, we've got lots of time to get ready. The final exam is not till April 22nd, so it's approximately 3 weeks from today. Okay, so some of the areas where we've had discussions. When auditors conduct an audit of a financial statement, they have to determine what their audit strategy is. So for audit strategy, we talked about things like, will auditors adopt an internal control testing strategy? So where internal control is strong in a company, usually auditors will test those internal controls. And this, the reason for this is to reduce the cost of the audit, of course. In other situations where internal control systems are not strong, auditors will adopt what's called a substantive testing strategy. And what that means is they're going to look more at documents, tests of detail, and as well do analytical procedures to determine whether they believe the numbers are correct as recorded in the financial statements. Okay, so it's either a control testing strategy or a substantive testing strategy. Again, usually for public companies, because they have good internal control systems, auditors normally use a control testing strategy. We talked about another concept in the course, and that was called directional testing. And what directional testing involves is simply if you want to verify certain assertions, which way do you conduct your audit test? So, for example, if you wanted to determine whether all sales invoices had been recorded, would you trace from the general ledger back to the sales invoices, or would you trace from shipping documents to the sales invoices? Okay, so the correct answer there would be you would trace from the shipping documents to the sales invoices to satisfy yourself on completeness. Okay, so the idea is you have to test in the right direction in order to be able to gather audit evidence about particular assertions. So you might anticipate there'll be some questions around directional testing on the final exam. Again, you can, if you want to read up more about directional testing, it's in both chapters 11 and 12. And certainly you can look, check out the index at the back of the text, and it could refer you to the page numbers. You can find more information available on that. With respect to testing of internal control, we talked about internal control systems being strong and what effect does that have on substantive procedures. Well, auditors like to rely on internal control because it reduces the sample sizes, right, that they have to do for substantive procedures. And also, sometimes they can do some of their work before the end of the year. So we talked about the idea, for example, of counting inventory before the end of the year, perhaps confirming of accounts receivable before the end of the year, right? And you can only do those procedures before the end of the year where internal control is strong. So strong internal control systems affect the timing of substantive procedures, and they also affect the sample sizes, right? They reduce the amount of work that auditors have to do if internal control is strong. We talked about another concept we talked about quite a bit in each of the accounting cycles was the concept of segregation or separation of duties. And essentially we said that one person should not have control over all aspects of a particular transaction. So for example, with respect to sales, someone should not be able to record an invoice, record cash coming in, and be responsible for handling of the physical cash. Right? We want to actually separate, right, the recording function from the handling of cash as an example. Okay, so we've had lots of examples in the textbook where we talked about separation or segregation of duties. Again, you might want to review that particular concept. It's in each of the chapters, 11, 12, and 13, with respect to those particular cycles. The revenue receivable receipt cycle, payable payments, right, cycle, and the payroll cycle. So chapters 11, 12, and 13. With respect to auditing of accounts payable, we talked about the fact that auditors are mostly concerned about the understatement of accounts payable. And the main reason for that, of course, is that if an account payable is not recorded, more than likely a corresponding expense is not recorded. So auditors do a lot of testing around the area of completeness of accounts payable. And one of the things that we talked about was auditors doing search for unrecorded liabilities. So that's covered in chapter 12. So at the end of the year, auditors will look to determine if there are any supplier invoices, for example, that have not been recorded at the end of the year. They'll send out confirmations, right, to suppliers to confirm the balance is owing as of the end of the client's fiscal year. So these are all tests designed, right, to ensure that the accounts payable are recorded properly at the end of the year and that they're not understated. So again, you might want to have read again, about the search for unrecorded liabilities and what's involved there from an audit perspective. In Chapter 11, we talked about the bank reconciliation process being an important process whereby the actual cash balances in a company are audited or reconciled to ensure that they are correct. So you might want to have a look at the bank reconciliation process just to ensure that you're comfortable with that. Where do the numbers come from in the bank reconciliation process? For example, the bank balance from the accounting records comes from the general ledger. The bank balance from the bank might come from an actual bank statement, right? From the bank, we might go online to find out what the bank balance is at the reconciliation date. And so we want to know what the source of that information is. We talked about the three risks, right? Internal control risk, inherent risk, and detection risk. So you should have some knowledge, right, in terms of what are those risks, what do they actually represent. So if I asked you what inherent risk means, you'd be able to tell me. Okay. So some of that, a little bit of that goes back to the midterm exam, but as we've seen throughout the course, those risks are consistently discussed throughout the textbook as they relate to even the various accounting cycles. So maybe to answer a question that might be out there, will there be any questions related to material studied up to the midterm exam? No is the answer, okay? So no, I'll say no specific questions relating to information tested before the midterm exam. All the questions are deal with information that we've covered after the midterm exam. Now, sometimes students ask, what's the best way to study for the final exam? I've had a few inquiries about this. And so, as I've mentioned, the best way to study would be to ensure you review the topics I'm mentioning today, right? Because these are obviously the most important topics in terms of what's going to be tested on the final exam. And then also just reviewing the PowerPoints that we've talked about from Chapter 11 onward. Again, if you do that and you review those PowerPoints and you understand the material, together with reviewing the topics I'm mentioning today, you should be fine, okay? That'll allow you to do very well on the final exam. Okay. Going forward from there, auditors document their audit procedures in certain ways. So you might recall in each of the accounting cycles, we talked about internal control questionnaires. We talked about doing flow charts. We talked about doing actual narrative descriptions. A narrative description is just manually or using a computer to type out a description of an accounting system. So you should be familiar with how auditors document their audit evidence that they have to gather throughout the audit process. We talked about during the audit of the purchases payable payment cycle, we talked about auditors sending out a confirmation letter to the lawyers, right, of their audit client. And so you might just want to review what's the purpose of sending out a letter to the lawyer who represents the audit client. Why do auditors do that? Okay, we discussed that during the course. Just right at the end of the course, we talked about what auditors do when they discover errors in the course of the audit, and assuming that they're material, what is their corresponding action? Right? So they summarize their errors in an error summary. We discussed that. But then what's their next step? Well, we talked about the fact they talk to management, right? And hopefully they have adjustments made to the financial statements. If management refuses, then they have to talk to the audit committee generally. If the audit committee refuses, then they would probably approach the board of directors, right? And then if the board of directors refuse, they may have to seek legal counsel, right? Because the financial statements are those of management, but if management's not going to correct material errors in the financial statements, that means the auditors are going to have to attach something other than a standard or clean audit opinion. And of course, that may be have a negative effect on the company and then put the auditors at some risk if the board of directors refuses to make changes to the financial statements. So it becomes a legal matter at that point. And of course, we know auditors cannot be associated with any information that might be false or misleading, right? Because under our ethical standards, we can't do that. And so it could create some legal consequences if auditors were to participate in that process. But normally, of course, management will make changes, and certainly anything discussed with the board of directors, because they don't want problems with investors either. Typically, they'll make changes required to the financial statements. The main reason for that, of course, is that auditors do have, right, what we call the hammer at the end of the audit process, and the hammer is their audit report. Right? And most companies want a clean audit opinion, so they'll normally make changes as required to the financial statements to ensure that they're not materially misleading. During the course of our class, we talked about different types of letters, a management letter of representation. So that's the letter at the end of the audit that the management team signs. So CEO and the CFO sign that letter. And that represents to the auditors that the financial statements are correct in all material aspects, and that the internal control system properly operated throughout the year. So again, you might want to have a look at the letter of representation in the text and what's involved there in terms of what management says to the auditors in that letter. We talked about the timing of substantive audit procedures. I've referred to this a little bit already, but we know that where internal control systems are strong, we mentioned that auditors can do some of their audit procedures before the end of the year. And we talked about the fact how far before the end of the year. Well, it's actually three months, right? So if they wanted to count inventory, they cannot do that more than 3 months before the end of the year. They can do it 2 months before the end of the year, 1 month before the end of the year, but not more than 3 months. The reason for that is we said that internal control systems are man-made systems. And of course, as we sort of see happening every day with information systems, they can be broken into or hacked, right? And so when information systems are hacked or other man-made systems are broken, they're not reliable, are they? And so with respect to internal control systems, because they are man-made systems, they're not considered 100% guaranteed that they'll be functioning all the time. They could break down, could be hacked, right? Controls could be overridden. And so we don't want to place 100% reliance just on the internal control system. And so we do not do our substantive tests more than 3 months before the end of the year. Okay, that's the maximum which is allowed under generally accepted auditing standards. With we mentioned computer systems along the way. We didn't go into a discussion of computer systems too much, but we mentioned that with respect to computer systems, they need to have strong input controls, processing controls, and output controls. Right, so we have to have control over the input going into the computer system. We have to have processing controls in place while the software is functioning to ensure that all the information is being processed and that it's being processed correctly by the computer system. And then once information is printed out on reports, generally, we need to have control over those reports, right, which are going to be distributed to management or other people internally in the firm. So we need internal controls to deal with information along that entire pathway: input, processing, and output. Okay, so again, there's going to be a number of questions, largely true and false questions, to some degree multiple choice questions in the areas that I've just mentioned. Now, in addition to that, there's going to be, again, these will be multiple choice questions, but the nature of the questions will be a bit different, so I want to make you aware of that. So the next types of questions you're going to have will be by accounting cycle. Okay, so there's going to be 3 or 4 questions on each of the accounting cycles. So the revenue receivable receipt cycle, purchase payable payment cycle, and the payroll cycle. And for each of those cycles, there'll be questions with respect to internal control, okay, within those cycles. Now, the best way to study in this area would be to review the internal control questionnaires. Okay, so we've pointed those out as we've gone through the text. Again, you don't have to memorize them because, while you're writing the exam, you're obviously going to have access to the textbook. So you'd be able to refer to the internal control questionnaire during the exam if you wanted to. Right? We recognize that. That's part of the way part of the risk, I'll say, the way we're conducting exams right now is they're essentially open book exams. So we've designed, of course, our exams knowing that. But within each of these cycles, there'll be, as I mentioned, 3 or 4 questions relating to internal control in each of the cycles. So if you study the internal control questionnaire, those questionnaires tell you, right, the controls that you should have within each of the cycles, and it speaks to those controls by assertion, right? And so there'll be a number of questions on the exam dealing with those internal controls as they relate to those assertions, sorry. And so, again, I think by studying those internal control questionnaires, you're going to be on top of the types of internal controls that should be in existence in each of the accounting cycles. And once you know that, you should be able to easily answer the questions on the final exam. Okay? So again, study the internal control questionnaires in addition to reviewing the PowerPoints that we've covered in the course, chapters 11 onward, and of course, the items that I'm mentioning today in this review lecture. Okay. Just having a look here to make sure I've covered off everything. We've talked about audit assertions, right, with respect to the assertions made by management in the set of financial statements. So just again, recapping, management asserts, right, the assets exist. Management asserts that the assets are properly valued. Management asserts that all the transactions have been recorded, right? That's the proper cutoff. Management asserts that all the liabilities have been recorded, right? That's a completeness assertion. So we've reviewed all those assertions. So you might want to review the assertions made by management. Again, that's sort of spread throughout the text, so you can certainly review those. Okay. There was a chart back in chapter 8, I believe it was, where it talked about the main assertions made by management. You might want to go back and look at that. But again, you don't have to. There's no questions that really related to that chart. It's just a matter that you need to be aware of what the assertions are made by management in a set of financial statements in order to answer some of the questions on the exam. Okay. So again, that's a high-level review in terms of the assertions. That's not a difficult area, but as we know, it's a very important area that needs to be reviewed in terms of preparing for the final exam. Okay, so if you had final exam questions in front of you now, I think what you would realize is that some of them are fairly detailed. So, for example, the internal control questionnaire type questions, right, that are asking you around about controls in a specific accounting system. Those questions will be about quite detailed information. On the other hand, many of the questions are more concept related. Okay. And so a lot about what we've talked about in the course is how auditors go about actually doing an audit. And again, we've talked about this essentially from a fairly high level, and that's the design of the bulk of the exam. As I mentioned, because we have talked about in some of the detailed areas, so for example, what I mentioned today with respect to directional testing, right? We did talk about in what direction should you test if you want to verify completeness of sales, for example, right? In what direction should you test if you wanted to verify completeness of liabilities, for example. Okay, so those types of things we've discussed in the class. Again, that's in the PowerPoints, right? Directional testing, it's in the textbook. Just look under directional testing. Again, if you have questions on that, you can certainly touch base with me. Okay, so if I had to mention, what are the most critical areas in terms of preparing for the final exam. It's mostly about internal control within the accounting cycles, right? Because largely that's what we've talked about in chapters 11, 12, and 13, right? There will not be many questions outside of those three chapters, okay? A little bit, maybe with respect to investments and financing, okay, which was chapter 14, but probably 95% of the exam or so, maybe even more than that, is based on chapters 11, 12, and 13. So those are really the ones for you to concentrate on in terms of your preparation. Again, no management's assertions. Have a look at those internal control questionnaires. That'll give you a lot of familiarity with respect to detailed controls, right, that should be in existence in each of those cycles. There will be no questions relating to audit reports themselves, right? So we've covered that before the midterm exam, basically. So this exam is largely more of a detailed nature, right, with respect to the accounting cycles, but yet also a lot at the very high level in terms of the concepts that we've discussed. Segregation of duties, right? Separation of duties, that concept. It's mentioned again in all three cycles. So of course you would expect a lot of questions, right? With respect to that particular topic, because it's in all three cycles. If it's in all three cycles, it means it's probably pretty important, right? So again, you can go back into the PowerPoints for those chapters, 11, 12, and 13, and it talks about separation or segregation of duties in each of the accounting cycles, okay? So that should help you, I think, in your studying again. So the most important things, just to recap, have a look at the PowerPoints, okay, for each of the chapters. And again, I would cover all the chapters because there are some questions, okay, relating to the latter chapters, but very few. So again, focus your time, 11, 12, and 13, okay, those chapters. So review the PowerPoints, make sure you're comfortable. If there's something you don't understand, shoot me an email, that's fine. I'm available, of course, during the next 3 weeks to answer questions. We can do a Teams meeting if you want as well, okay? So you wanna make sure you're going into the final exam being as prepared as possible, okay? So review the PowerPoints. Number 2, review the internal control questionnaires, right, for the three cycles, right, the revenue cycle, the payroll cycle, and the purchase payable payment cycle. So again, chapters 11, 12, and 13. Okay, that'll help you out there. And obviously you can review your notes as well. Okay, so that's what you should do to prepare. Study all the areas I've mentioned, right, in this review lecture today, and you should be fine. Now, one thing you should not do, okay, sometimes students tell me after the exam, especially where they didn't do too well, part of the problem is they tell me that, well, they read the entire textbook. There's no need to read the entire textbook, right? From everything before the midterm is not being reviewed tested on the final exam. So, basically reviewing chapters 1 through 10 is not going to help you at all. If you wanted to read chapters 11, 12, and 13 in the text, like read the entire chapter, sure, that would probably be helpful. Do you have to do that? No, but there's a lot of detail in there that would only help you as opposed to hurt you. Do I advise you to read it? Not necessary. You don't have to read the entire chapter to prepare for the final exam. What I would do, though, is the areas I've mentioned today and areas in the PowerPoints that you're not familiar with, that's where I would use the textbook and go back and read up on those areas, okay? So the areas where you think you might be weak, go and study those areas some more. The areas you feel you understand, you don't have to spend as much time on, right? Because you're comfortable with those, all right? So again, the exam is going to be 1.5 hours long, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Actually, a few minutes before that, roughly 5 to 10 minutes before that, I'm going to be uploading the exam. You'll have to get the exam back to me by 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it's on April 22nd. Okay, and I will be sending out an email to everyone on the exam process. Again, if there's any difficulties at all during your studying or preparation, make sure to contact me before. One of the things you should not do, in addition to reading the entire text, what you should not do is ignore the things that I've said in this review lecture. Right? These are the most important topics for you to study. Okay? Sometimes students say, again, it's typically students that don't do too well. They say, "Oh, I didn't study, the topics you said were important." Well, why wouldn't you do that? Right? I mean, that you should do that. Right? I'm directing you to the most important areas. And sometimes students say, "Oh, I just thought you were kidding." I said, "Well, no, I'm not kidding. I'm trying to help you, right, in terms of your marks and make sure that you do well in the course." And actually to tell you, these are the key areas, and then if they're not, that would actually be misleading you, right? And of course, that would not be honest. And we want to do things that are honest, right? Because we want to maintain our own reputation. So these types of things should certainly help you prepare, help you to do well. In terms of when I say well, okay, help you to do well, it doesn't mean it'll get you 95% average on the exam. I'm sure some people will get in the 90s on the exam, but it should allow you to do, certainly better than 70%. Okay, so better than 70, and maybe even better than 80. So the key areas now. It's just a matter of investing your time, plan your time, okay, to study the exam. Another key thing for you to do. Sometimes students get nervous, okay, before they come to write the exam. So here's a couple things I suggest just to relax your nerves a bit. Before you actually start the exam, okay, on exam day, just once you download the exam, before you even start writing the exam, just take some deep breaths. Just do that 3 times, okay? When you take the deep breaths like that and you exhale, that has what's called a physiological effect on your body. It just relaxes your nerves, okay? So 3 deep breaths, and that works to help relax you before you write the exam. Another thing to do, again, depending on your location, maybe a half hour before the exam, just go for a little walk. Go for a little walk outside if you can, get some fresh air. Depending where you're located, that may be possible or not. Depending what time of night it is or what time of day it is, maybe it's possible or not. But just go for a brief walk if you can. If you're inside, do a brief walk inside. If you're hopefully outside for a few minutes, right? That little bit of exercise has again a physiological effect on your body and just helps to relax your nerves a bit more. Okay, so those are typically the 2 things I find if students do that will help them relax. Now during the exam, because they are true and false questions and multiple choice, what I would suggest as a wise way to answer the questions would be read each question twice. Read the question first, okay, and look at the possible answers and pick one, or decide if it's a true or false answer. Then read the question a second time, and then decide, do you think you have the correct answer, right? Is the answer still the same? Sometimes when you read a question the second time, you read or understand things a bit differently, or you see something new in the question that you didn't see the first time that you read it, okay? So by reading the question twice, yes, it does obviously take a little bit longer to do each question, but the key is to do well on each question, right? There's no sense in running through an exam to answer every question if you haven't understood the question well enough, right? The likelihood of scoring well if you're rushing through the exam is not very good, right? As opposed to read the question, select an answer, and then read it again. If you have the same answer, great, it's probably the right answer. If it's not, right, you might say, oh, that's not the right answer, right? Actually, one of the other answers is the better answer, and you select something different. But it's only because you read the question twice and you understood something differently the second time, or you were more relaxed when you read it the second time, okay? So very often, that's what I advise students as well, especially for an exam in this type of format, read the question carefully, right? And to some degree, if you can, take the time and read the question twice. Okay, there's lots of time because of the nature of the exam, true and false, multiple choice, right? You don't have to write long paragraphs to give your answer. Um, you just have to indicate a T for true, an F for false, right? Or select in a multiple choice, obviously select answer A, B, C, or D, or E, okay? And put that on your Excel spreadsheet. So it's very straightforward in terms of what the process is. It doesn't take long to answer the questions. So given that it doesn't take long to answer the questions, you do have time to read the questions twice. Right? If you had to read a question and then write a 3-sentence answer, and before you did that, read the question a second time and still write a 3-sentence answer, that would take a lot of time, wouldn't it? But when you just have to make a selection, true or false, or select an item that's multiple choice, then of course that's a lot easier, right, to do. And the last thing I'll mention as well, and I'm doing all this on my exams, and all of my exams, there'll be a sheet, the very first page of the exam. It's a sheet where you have to agree that you will follow the academic rules of the University of Windsor with respect to examinations. So what it will specifically say is you cannot have communication with anyone during the exam. You cannot use the internet during the exam. Okay. You cannot have reference to the textbook or any of your study notes during the exam. Okay, so each of you, you have to sign that, okay, and return it to me with your exam paper. Now, if you can electronically sign, that is my preferred way to have you sign. If you want to print it, sign it, and send it back to me with your exam, that's fine. You can do that too. Or if you can't do any of those things, yes, I will accept just a typed version of your name. Okay. However you do it, again, handwritten or electronic signature is preferred. But failing that, if you don't have either of those capabilities, yes, I will accept simply typing your name into. There's 2 locations where you have to put your name. Okay. And that's just, of course, meant to ensure the integrity of the exam, and that by writing and inserting your name into those 2 sections before you start the exam makes a commitment right from you to the university that you're going to follow the rules. If you do not sign in some way that first sheet on the exam, it just means your exam will not be graded. Okay. If the exam is not graded, there's a 0 assigned, and of course that would damage your score. So you don't want that to happen. So again, I use this in all my courses to ensure that, to the extent we can, that the exam process has more integrity in it. And really, I always tell all my students this in all my courses. If you cheat on an exam, who are you really cheating? You're really cheating yourself, because you've completed a course and you have to ensure, do you understand the material or not? If you cheat to get a higher grade, yeah, you might get a higher grade if you're not caught cheating, but do you really know the material? At the end of the day, when you graduate, do you graduate because you understand the material you studied, or do you graduate because you cheated? Right? At the end of the day, once you graduate, okay, and have a degree, when you go out and get a job, your employer is going to expect you to be able to do certain things. And if you can't do those certain things because you just cheated your way through the system, as opposed to actually writing the exams that demonstrated your knowledge, you're not going to have your job very long. So usually I tell students, of course, if you cheat, you're really cheating yourself. And why would you do that? You're spending a lot of money to try and learn things, and you should have an assessment which tells you, have you learned things or not? So 98% of the people in the course, you're all doing fine with your grades. So I have no reason to believe that the final exam should be any different. Okay. But again, I would encourage you to follow the rules. You do have to sign in some manner that sheet that will be attached to the exam, and you return that to me with your exam paper, okay, with the Excel spreadsheet to be completed. Okay, so it'll be attached to the Excel spreadsheet when you get it. Okay, so again, you just electronic signature or hand signature is preferred. If not, that's fine. Type in your name and we'll go with that, okay, as your commitment to follow the rules and not to break the rules during the exam period. Obviously, if you do break the rules during the exam period and that's discovered, that also results in a 0 grade on your paper, which of course would mean that you would fail the course. So I don't think anybody wants that to happen. I don't want that to happen. And so I can only encourage you to follow the academic rules of the university, right? And find out how much you know, right? And have that confirmed through the exam process. Anyhow, the marks so far, as I said, they're all, everybody, 98% of you are doing great. So there's no real reason to be motivated to cheat, really, okay, from my perspective. Okay, so that ends my review lecture today and comments about the final exam period. So again, if you do have any questions, problems, concerns, as I said, send me an email, or if you need a Teams meeting just to, satisfy yourself that you do understand some of the concepts, or that, especially where you're having difficulty, let me know and we can arrange a Teams meeting as well. Okay. Thanks everybody again for attending the course. I've appreciated your time, especially for those of you that are at a distance. I do hope that you've learned a lot about auditing and what auditors do, and so that you'll be able to interact with auditors in your role as members of management. And also, of course, maybe some of you will go on and wanted to become auditors yourself. Right? Maybe some of you are thinking about becoming professional accountants. So again, if you're thinking about any of those things, I'd be happy to talk to you about careers in accounting as well. Okay. Thanks everybody. Take care, and hopefully once we're on campus, please do introduce yourself to me. Okay. I'm hoping. I'm not sure it's going to happen in September yet. There's still a lot of discussion about when we're going to go back live on campus. I think some courses, probably there'll be limited offerings in September. The main issue is I don't think, certainly in Canada, because our vaccination process is going very slowly, I'm not sure by September, what percentage of the population is going to be vaccinated at that point. And even students coming in, how many will be vaccinated by that point. So my own guess would be it's probably going to be next January, so January of 2022, before we're back on campus full time. But again, depending how things go over the summer, if they go a lot faster than maybe we anticipate, maybe we'll be back on campus in September. But I know both faculty and students are starting to look forward to that happening. So again, we can have closer relationships with each other and get to know each other a little bit as instructor-student, and have a professional relationship even going forward into future years. Okay. So again, thanks everybody. It's been a pleasure, and have a great day and a great period in terms of your exam preparation. Okay. Good luck to everybody in the final exam. And if I don't see you before, I will see you on April 22nd. Didn't mention, but I will be available during the exam period. Okay. So on April 22nd, from 7, basically from 7 till 8:30 p.m., I'll be available by email during the exam. Okay, so yes, you can use the internet to interact with me. Okay, so if you have questions during the exam, you can shoot me an email and I'll respond. Okay, so that's just one of the things I do to try and make the exam process as similar as if we were physically together, right? Because if we were physically together, you'd be able to ask a question. So at least by being available through the internet, if you have a question, I can try to respond to that, okay, during the exam period. So that way you don't feel quite that you're alone, right, in terms of preparing for the exam. All right. So good luck, everybody, with your studying. And again, questions, problems, please get in touch with me. Okay. Take care of yourself and continue to be safe. Catch you later. Bye-bye.